Good morning, everybody. It is so good to have you here today on all three campuses as we begin this brand new teaching series on the subject of work. And I am so looking forward to what we're going to be talking about over the next 3 to 4 weeks. And before we jump in, let me just say this. Last Sunday here at Parker Hill Community Church was just absolutely amazing. And if you weren't here last Sunday, I just got to say, you picked a really bad week to miss church, because last Sunday we had the privilege of celebrating with 127 people who took the next step of baptism. And that is just always an incredible celebration experience here in this church. And I want to spend a few minutes before we jump into the teaching today just telling you some of the stories behind some of the images that you saw a few minutes ago in that recap video. I wish we had time to tell all 127 stories, because I think every story of God's grace is an amazing story. But just to give you a glimpse behind the scenes, I thought I'd share just a few stories with you. And you'll probably want to clap after some of these stories, but just hold that. And then when I'm done, we'll celebrate one more time together what God did here last week. This first picture up on the side screens is a picture of a group of Marywood University students. They attend our 5 o'clock Sunday service at Dixon City. They sit right up front every week, and then this past Sunday, 4 out of the 7 stepped forward and were baptized as a public declaration of their faith. And I love that, because I love to see young people in the formative years of their lives declaring their faith boldly. That was just so encouraging. This next picture is a picture of one of our pastors that you know, Jason Castelli. And Jason, last Sunday, had the opportunity of baptizing his own sister. And he wasn't even planning on doing that. She just decided in one of our Sunday evening services to step out and be baptized. And he happened to be there. And it was just an incredibly moving moment, and a very significant moment as well, because up until recently, Jason was the only believer in his family, and now his sister joins him, and that was a great moment as well. This next picture is a young man by the name of Philip, and about 2 years ago, Philip was working on a research paper for college, and he decided to write a research paper on Parker Hill Community Church. And Philip had grown up in the church in a different denomination. In fact, his dad was a priest in a denomination that allows priests to marry. But Philip was intrigued with this church, and so he decided to do his research paper on this church. And he interviewed Mark Fitch, and then he attended a couple of services. And he wrote his paper, and he turned it in, and we never really heard much from him after that. Well, this past spring, he graduated, and then he went back home to Buffalo. But last weekend, he happened to be in town visiting a friend of his. And he said that Sunday morning, he woke up out of a dead sleep and had this undeniable sense that God was telling him to go to Parker Hill Community Church. And he didn't even know why until he got here last Sunday. And Mark Fitch had the opportunity of baptizing him. That was just an incredible story to see unfold. And then I'll give you one more example, one more picture. This is Esther. Esther was baptized in our 5 o'clock service last Sunday. And that was really a cool thing, because Esther is 104 years old. Let me tell you something. It is never too late to take your next step. It really isn't. And by the way, we kind of discovered this after the fact, but according to the Guinness Book of World Records, Esther is now the oldest person on record to be baptized by immersion. The previous record was 97. I mean, that's incredible. So I think we ought to just celebrate one more time all 127 stories, all 127 baptisms that happened last Sunday. And I don't know about you, but for me, hearing those stories, man, I never get tired of that. That never gets old for me. And if you're a follower of Christ, and if that doesn't, just excite you and wake up your heart, then I would be, honestly, very concerned. So I was encouraged by that. Let me just say also, I'm very encouraged by the fact that we've had a couple of hundred people who've stepped forward and moved out of being just a passenger to being a crew member. So if you're one of those people who signed up to serve somewhere, or especially you came to the volunteer orientation, I just want to say thank you, because our church will be stronger because of you. So I don't know how your job is going, but my job is going really well these days. And today we're beginning this new series. We're talking about our jobs, we're talking about work, and over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be talking about what God has to say about the way that we do our work. And I think this is an incredibly important subject, especially given the vast amount of time that most adults spend in the workplace. We will spend the majority of our waking hours as adults at work if we have a full-time job. And around here at Parker Hill Community Church, we believe our faith as believers ought to affect every part of our lives. We don't just leave it here inside the church building and come back and experience it an hour a week. We think that our faith ought to inform everything that we do, including the way that we do our jobs. So we're going to talk about work, and as we begin today, just let me encourage you to grab that connection card that you received as you came in. And I just got to say that we've got some really, really gifted people on staff who reformatted this for us. I love the new formatting. It is clean and simple and clear and less cluttered, and we're killing less trees, so it's a big win for everybody all the way around. But you're going to notice on the back of that connection card, there's a white space that says notes, because here's what I've discovered about teaching. I know that it's impossible for you to remember everything that I say in 30 or 35 minutes. So here's what we want you to do. I want you to think about, as I talk, 2 or 3 things that really resonate with you. 2 or 3 things that God is impressing upon your heart on this subject of work, and you write those things down, and then you think about those things this week, focus on them, and begin to apply them. And again, I'll say, as I say every week, that we want you to continue learning. After church is over, we want you to keep growing after you leave here today, and we always give you a tool to do that called App Notes, and we used to put those inside the bulletin. The way you're going to get those now, you have several avenues. If we have your email address, you'll start getting an email every Monday morning with the App Notes, and you can easily opt out of that if that's kind of a pain in the neck. Just you can click on that email and opt out. The App Notes are also on the Facebook page for the church every single day, and you can also get a hard copy of those if you don't have a computer. You can pick up some App Notes on your way out today at the Welcome Center. So we have got you covered. No excuse to not continue learning after you leave here today. So let's jump in. As we begin today, I just want to lay the foundation really for this entire series by helping us to think clearly about work. Because I think there are many, many people in our culture who believe that work is nothing more than a necessary evil. Like, I have to work to earn the money I need to pay the bills that I've accumulated. That work is kind of a curse that has to be endured so that I have the money and the cash that I need to have a really good time on the weekend. And that's sometimes the way people feel about work, but when you look into the Bible, you discover a very different message. That work is not a curse. In fact, work is a gift given by God to us. That work is meant to be an avenue by which we bless other people, and by which we find fulfillment, and by which we bring glory to our Creator. And you see this message beginning to unfold from the very beginning of the Bible. I'm going to start in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Here's what it says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I want you to notice something. You only get 5 words into the Bible before work is mentioned. You know, the very first thing that we learn about God is not about His holiness or His righteousness. The very first thing we are told about God is that He is a worker. He is a creator. The very first activity recorded in the Bible was not a worship service or a prayer meeting or a charitable act of giving. The very first activity recorded in the Bible was a day of work. And so I think right there in the very first sentence in the Bible, work is being elevated as something that is a sacred gift from God and a sacred calling. So you keep reading in chapter 1, it describes God's work creating all that we see around us. And then you come to verse 27, and it says, so God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them. Now think about this. If God is a worker, and if we are created in the image of God, that means we too have been created to work. We are wired to find meaning and fulfillment in the use of our gifts and abilities. And many of you could talk about a time in your life or a role that you've had, or maybe that you have right now, that when you do what you're called to do, it just gives you this divine sense of satisfaction. And that's because we were made that way. We were made to work. We were made to contribute to the flourishing of mankind. And you see this beginning to unfold in the very next chapter, right after Adam is created, like right off the bat. God gives him a job description. Chapter 2, verse 15, it says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." And by the way, the word work in verse 15, it literally means to prepare or to develop. Literally what this is saying here in verse 15 is this, that even though this world was created as being very good, God created this world with untapped potential. And it was Adam's responsibility to unlock that potential, to develop, to manage, to create, to improve, to care for this garden. I've heard it compared to the difference between a stockbroker and a security guard. If I were to give a security guard $1,000 and then come back 10 years later, I would expect to get back $1,000, not a penny more, not a penny less. If, on the other hand, I give $1,000 to a stockbroker, I would expect to come back 10 years later and have a lot more than the amount of money that I originally gave him. Because the job of a stockbroker is to take the money I give to him and to cultivate it and to develop it. And that's the point here. Adam was given this earth, and he was given skills and abilities, and he had the responsibility of taking what God had given him and just developing it and cultivating it and improving it. And this is the nature of work. This is the high calling of work. The farmer takes the raw materials of soil and seed, and he cultivates it, and he produces a crop. The contractor takes the raw materials of cement and wood, and he produces a home for a family to live in. An artist takes the raw materials of music or color and creates a work of art to be enjoyed by many, many, many people. An attorney takes the raw materials of the principles of ethics and fairness and justice and codifies that into laws that benefit society. And so through our work, we really become co-creators with God. We are called to bring order and beauty to this world, and through our work to bless others, and to find in ourselves a sense of fulfillment, and through all of that, to bring glory to God. And what that means is this, simply this, that all work is sacred. I mean, God isn't just pleased with the work of a pastor or a missionary. All work is honorable and sacred to God. Like I've said so many times, I get paid to be good. You guys are good for nothing. Just kidding. But you keep reading. You come to Genesis chapter 3, and you know mankind rebels, sin enters the world, and then everything in the world is cursed by sin, including work. And I think, honestly, the workplace is one of the places where we see most clearly the brokenness of this world and the curse of sin. So here's the question. Here's the question we have to answer. How can we as believers do our work in a way that honors God even in a broken world? How can we as believers engage in that sacred calling of work in a way that is redemptive in a world that may not even understand how important this is to the heart of God? So in the rest of our time, I want to focus your attention on one passage of Scripture in the New Testament. It's the book of Ephesians. It was a letter written in the first century to believers in the city of Ephesus, written by Paul as he kind of disciples them and helps them grow from a distance by writing this letter. So go ahead and turn there if you have an old school paper copy of the Bible, or if you have a copy of the Bible on your phone or on your tablet, get to Ephesians chapter 6. And we're just going to cover about 5 verses 5 through 9. Now, as you're making your way there, I just want to acknowledge something. I know that not all of you hearing this message have a job in the typical sense of that word. But here's what I want you to understand. Even if you don't have a Monday through Friday job with a paycheck, you still have some kind of work assignment. For some of you, you're a college student and your work assignment is to study hard and to prepare for the future and not waste your parents' money. Okay, that's your job for right now. Some of you, you might be a stay-at-home mom, and your work assignment right now is to manage your household and to nurture the next generation, and there is no more important job, I think, than that. Some of you, your work assignment doesn't give you a paycheck because you're retired now and you volunteer your time, which in my opinion is the purpose of retirement. So we all don't have a job, but we all have a work assignment. And so as we talk about work this week and the next 3 weeks, You can just apply this in whatever way it fits best in your particular situation as the Holy Spirit leads you. So, Ephesians chapter 6, this section that we're going to look at in this letter, this was written to slaves and masters. And I have to stop here and acknowledge something and explain something. Otherwise, you're going to be distracted for the next 10 minutes or might even be upset, because you might be asking yourself as we work through this passage, why doesn't the Bible come right out and condemn the practice of slavery? Why didn't Paul just write this letter and say, cut it out, One of the things we have to understand here is that slavery in the first century was very different from the slavery that we saw practiced in our own country, because slavery in the first century was not based on race. It was not based on skin color. It didn't come about when you were kidnapped and put in chains and sold to someone. For the most part in the first century, slavery was driven more by economic factors than anything else. So if you were in debt and could not repay what you owed, you couldn't file for bankruptcy, couldn't get another credit card. So you would become a slave to that person until the obligation of your debt was fulfilled. Or sometimes there were parents who were so financially destitute, they would actually sell their children into slavery because they would have a better chance at being fed and clothed and cared for in slavery than they would with their own parents. Slavery was sometimes punishment for a crime, and slavery was even a pathway to citizenship in the Roman Empire. So there were all kinds of reasons for slavery in the first century. In fact, it was so common that many historians say that about a third of the people in the Roman Empire in the first century were slaves. And they were the economic engine. They were the ones who did most of the physical work. So when you read about slavery in the New Testament, it's not what we sometimes picture. And at the same time, I've got to acknowledge it wasn't a picnic either. You couldn't just give your 2-week notice and, go work for somebody else. And the master had ultimate authority over you while you were in slavery, and he could make your life miserable. So when the church began to grow there in Ephesus, what started to happen was that masters and slaves became believers, and they would start to come to church together. And of course, this created some tension. And so Paul writes this letter, and he addresses both sides of this slave-master relationship. And this is a great passage for us when it comes to our work, because I believe the application to our culture is pretty easy to make, that the principles are there. Because here's the truth. All of us in our jobs are somewhere between a master and a slave, okay? Like some of you feel like you're about 4 inches above slavery in your job. You're not. You can quit. Some of you think you're a master and that you own the people that work for you, and you need to be reminded that you're not. But all of us are somewhere there in that continuum between master and slave. And there's one idea in this passage, and this, if you write nothing else down on that connection card today, you got to write this down. This one principle will change the way you engage in your work. And I shared this phrase, I think about 5 years ago, and I still have people today who remember it and who mention it. So I thought I'd resurrect it again, because it's, like I said, a principle that will completely change the way you do your work. Here it is, real simple. Never forget the name of your boss. Never forget the name of your boss. And I'm not talking about Joe or Bob or Linda. Here's what I'm saying. If you're a follower of Christ, you don't ultimately work for the guy who signs your paycheck. You don't ultimately work for the person who does your performance evaluation. You don't work for the CEO or a board of directors. If you're a follower of Christ, ultimately you work for him and for his glory. And you see this theme come up in this passage over and over again. Let me give you some examples here. Verse 5, it says, just as you would obey Christ. Verse 6, as slaves of Christ. Verse 7, as if you were serving the Lord, not people. Verse 8, the Lord will reward each one. And as we're going to see, what the point of the passage is this, that no matter what you do for work, if you're a believer, if you're a follower of Christ, ultimately we work as if we are working for him. So here's the key. Never forget the name of your boss. Now, I'm not suggesting that you actually say this to your actual boss. Okay, don't go into work Monday morning and say, hey dude, guess what I learned at church on Sunday? You're not my boss. Okay, don't say that, because that may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. but work that way and know that inside your heart. Because here's the whole point of that point. The point is this: you get up every morning, you get ready to go to work, and you pray a prayer something like this one. You say, Lord, today I'm working for you. Today, I'm going to do my job in a way that's going to bring a smile to your face, because I know that ultimately you are my master, you are my boss, you are my employer. That's what I'm talking about. So let's get specific. Paul goes on here and he speaks first of all to the slaves, to those who were under authority. If we use today's terminology, the employees. Verse 5, he says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart. And this is speaking to the attitude that we bring to our jobs. Because really, come on, it's common practice in most places of work to gossip about the boss, to undermine his or her authority, to generally make her life miserable. And if you've ever worked around people like that, you know how that kind of spirit just becomes infectious in a workplace. But I think what Paul is saying to us, what God is saying to us is this: as followers of Christ, we should bring a different aroma to the workplace, that we're called to serve those in authority over us with respect and with sincerity. To which some of you right now are saying, Mark, you know, that's easy for you to say. You work in a church, and your boss is Jesus, I guess. You know, you never had a boss like mine. You don't understand how he makes my life miserable. You don't understand how unreasonable she is. That person, my boss, does not deserve my respect. And all that may be true. But if you say that, do you know why you're saying that? You forgot the name of your boss. You forgot who you're working for. Because you don't work for the person who signs your paycheck. Ultimately, you work for the Savior. Look at the end of verse 5. Here's why you do that. Just as you would obey Christ. Like, even if your manager's name is spelled J-E-R-K, even then, God calls you to respect him or to respect her, because in doing so, ultimately, what you're doing is you're honoring Christ himself. And we'll talk more about that one next week, what to do when your boss legitimately is a jerk. Okay, verse 6, let's keep reading. It says, obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. And there's an interesting contrast here, the beginning and the end of this verse. It says, you work not to win their favor when their eye is on you. Contrast, from your heart. To win their favor when their eye is on you. You know, when I read that verse, I couldn't help but think back to junior high physical education class, because I can still remember what would happen whenever the coach would have us do push-ups. Okay, so we would all get in position on the floor, and then he would start to count off the cadence, right? Up, down, up, down. He'd be walking around, up, down. And as long as he was watching, everybody do their best. But the moment he turned away, half the guys would go into a holding pattern, right? Up, down, up, down. Now, I wouldn't do that, of course. You can probably tell. But that was how we did push-ups in gym class, only when his eye was upon you. And you know what? So often in the workplace today, that's the attitude. That what really matters is that you look like you're working hard, not that you actually work hard. Listen, if you only work hard when somebody is watching you, do you know what your problem is? You forgot the name of your boss. You forgot who you work for, because if you're a follower of Christ, then whatever you do it for him. Look at what it says again at the end of verse 6. We should be like slaves of Christ himself, doing the will of God from your heart. Because listen, when Jesus is your boss, you've got an inner motivation. You don't need somebody watching you all the time. Verse 7, he keeps going. Serve wholeheartedly, it says. And to work wholeheartedly means that you give your best to your job. That you do more than just the minimum that is expected of you. That you put your whole self into it. You don't just go through the motions and punch the clock. You do whatever you do wholeheartedly. And listen, if you do that, you will have no trouble getting and keeping a job, because that is like gold in today's world, because it is so incredibly rare. There's a website that's kind of humorous. It's entitled "You Had One Job," And it's got all these images of people who like had one job assignment and they failed at it miserably. You won't be able to see this if you're watching online, but I'll show a few pictures here in the venue. This first one, this may explain all the bike accidents that happened on that bike path right there. Like you had one job, okay? Or this one. You get this medal and you're wondering, okay, did I come in first or third? Like, okay, you had one job. Or one of my favorites, this door at Target for those who have multiple personality disorder, okay? All right, not exactly wholehearted work right there, okay? That's like the opposite of what we're talking about. But here's my premise. Those of us who are believers, we ought to be, I think, the best performing, hardest working, most honest people in any company. To which you say, well, Mark, you don't understand. Because there's no incentive to work hard at my job. Nobody ever recognized that everybody else steals my ideas. I haven't had a pay raise in years. So I don't see any reason why I should give my best effort at work. And if you feel that way, and all that may be true, but if you feel that way, I can tell you why you feel that way. You forgot the name of your boss. Look at verse 7 again. Serve wholeheartedly. As if you were serving whom? The Lord, not people. Because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. In other words, as followers of Christ, we are called to see our work from a different perspective, that we see eternal realities. We work for a whole different pay scale. And we're called to look beyond the immediate rewards or the lack of immediate rewards and recognize that there is a faithfulness that God Himself will reward someday. And so we work for that honor and that paycheck. I love what Martin Luther King Jr. said one time when he was giving a message at the New Covenant Baptist Church in Chicago. He said this. He said, if a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted, or Beethoven composed music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will pause to say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. We serve wholeheartedly because we know who we're ultimately serving. Now, one more verse in this passage, and this last one kind of turns the tables. This last verse, verse 9, is written to masters. And in our culture, if we make the translation, this would apply to supervisors and leaders and managers, business owners. I'll just use the generic term leaders. If you lead other people, whether it's 4 people or 40 people or 400 people, verse 9 is for you. And it begins with a powerful statement, verse 9. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. In other words, he says, treat those under your authority the way that you would want to be treated if you were in their shoes. And by the way, this was some incredibly counter-cultural teaching, because in that day, a slave was seen as nothing more than a living tool. In the first century Roman Empire, slaves did not have the respect that a master would have. And so Paul, even in saying this, was elevating slaves to the same level of personhood as their masters. And it was this kind of teaching that would ultimately undo slavery in that culture. And he says, listen, those slaves under your authority, they're not just a cog in your machinery. They're not just a tool for your use. They're people made in the image of God. And so if you're in leadership, you treat them the way you want to be treated. And he goes on to say, do not threaten them. Don't use your position or your authority to intimidate people to just get what you want. That's not good leadership. And in fact, that's just not even wise. I mean, even business leaders know that. Let me tell you, one of the problems with leading people by threats and intimidation, it always backfires on you, because oppressive leadership breeds contempt and sabotage. Meaning if you kind of lead that way, if you're a leader, I'm speaking to you, if you lead that way, everybody might smile at you, and everything's going to look good, and then they're going to spit in your coffee. That's just the way that goes. There was a study that was done about 5 years ago by Florida State University where they gave this confidential survey to hundreds of workers, and they discovered that employees with what they would describe as abusive bosses always found ways to get even. Like 30% slowed down or purposely made mistakes. 29% took time off when not sick. 25% took longer breaks than they were allowed to have. I mean, leading that way doesn't even work well. But leading the way that Jesus leads, that has a whole different effect. Now, if you're a believer, you're in a leadership position, that doesn't mean you don't have clear standards. That doesn't mean you neglect good management practices. But here's the thing. If you're a leader, you figure out a way to do well in business and at the same time do well by the people who help you do well in business. Because for you, it's not just about the bottom line. For you, it's not just about best practices. It's about leading as Jesus would lead. Because here's what should motivate you to lead this way. Look at the end of verse 9. Since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. In other words, if you're a leader and you're a Christian, you have a boss too. Even if you're the CEO, even if you're the sole owner of the company, you also have a boss. And that's Jesus Christ himself, and he was a servant leader. And so you lead with the Spirit of Christ. So here's the bottom line as we begin this series for those of you who work, and we all work in some capacity. The bottom line is this: no matter where you happen to be on the organizational chart, you can never forget the name of your boss. Never forget the name of your boss, because that makes all the difference. Remember who you ultimately work for. Now let me tell you what hangs in the balance on this. See, for 8 hours a day, the people you work with get to see you up close. Closer, perhaps, than anybody else in your life. And they watch you, and they listen to you, and they evaluate. And do you know what I think is the biggest obstacle to people coming to Christ and accepting Christianity? I don't think it's intellectual doubts. I think the biggest obstacle to Christianity is Christians. And sometimes it's the Christians with whom unbelievers have worked or with whom they have done business. So, when you show up late and leave early and complain about the boss and shovel off work on everybody else, nobody will take you seriously about anything, especially the gospel. That's what is at stake. And see, I just think we need to have a bigger vision for our jobs. We need to have a bigger vision as a church and as Christians for work. Because I think way too many Americans see their jobs and their work as a way to just stow away some money in a retirement account so they can reach a certain age and retire and move to Florida and live in a 55-plus community with Bermuda shorts up to their armpits, and that's the reason they work. I think we have to have a much bigger vision and recognize that the workplace is the environment where we can bring light to the darkness and give witness to our faith without even saying a word, just by working well. Never forget the name of your boss. And here's the bottom line of that. If Jesus is your boss, really, he's the one you're working for, then guess what? Every time you go to work and all that you do in work, it is an act of worship. Don't worship your work, okay? We'll talk about that in 3 weeks, but your work is an act of worship if you're a believer. See, we don't just worship on Sundays. We really authentically worship if we're worshiping Monday through Friday as well. And we don't just worship inside a church building. We worship inside classrooms and offices and factories. And whatever your daily work looks like, the way that you do that can become an act of worship to God. And so every morning, here's what you do. Just get up in the morning, and you pray a prayer of surrender, and you pray a prayer of worship, and you say, Lord, today, I'm going to follow you and acknowledge you as my leader, and I'm going to do my work as unto you. And I'm going to work for an audience of one and worship you in the way that I work.